Hello, everybody. I'm Suresh Srinivasan. I coordinate the Beginner Special Interest Group, also called the BSIG, for the Minnesota Astronomical Society. We have a great treat tonight, or today. Dave Falkner is going to present on mythology of the night sky. I want to say, I'm not sure if he's on the call or not, but Mike Shaw last month gave an amazing presentation. We had 67 people at one point listening in, and it was fantastic. Unfortunately, we had some technical glitches, and the recording didn't record any sound. So we actually have the video of it, but not the sound, unfortunately. We switched over to Zoom for this call, and we're trying it now this way and recording it today. So if you wanted to check on anything, it'll probably be posted on the forum probably tomorrow or the next day by Walt Tribergs. So a little bit about today's call, our presentation, so about Dave Falkner. Dave Falkner, just to be honest, is one of my favorite guys in the club. A little bit about him that I just pulled off an email that we got from the club this morning. Dave's been interested in astronomy for many years, since he was a preteen in Indianapolis. He built a 6-inch Newtonian telescope when he was young, and he used that for many years. He joined the military. I think he was in the Navy. He joined it in 1973, became an officer in 1980. And during that time in the Navy, he actually worked in Monterey, California, with a group that was associated with trying to do outreach for local schools. Dave retired from the Navy in 1993 and moved to the Twin Cities and joined the club and continued his love for astronomy. He's actually taught astronomy at local community colleges and has done some extensive outreach, both for being one of the club's, I think there's 2, NASA Solar System Administrators, and of course, most recently as president of the Minnesota Astronomical Society. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Falkner.
Thanks, Suresh. Welcome, everybody. And on this very cold afternoon.
Hey, Dave, something I forgot to mention real quick.
Sure.
Hey, guys, so if you have a question, put it in the chat. So if you scroll to the bottom of your screen and that pane comes up, the chat button is right in the middle. If you have a question, go ahead and put it into that chat, and then every couple minutes, I'll read it off to Dave so he can answer that. Just to keep things flowing, okay? Go ahead, Dave.
Okay. Well, welcome, everybody. And I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about the mythology of the night sky. It is the subject of a book that I've written. In fact, I've written the original book, and then the second edition just came out, and that's what you see on the screen is the cover of the second edition on that. And as I said, it's based on the best-selling book that I've ever had. So I'm going to talk a little bit not only about the content of the book. I'm actually going to expand that a little bit at the beginning and talk a little bit about ancient astronomy and how the mythological the mythology of the Greeks and Romans came about. So getting started here. Let's see next. There we go. So mankind has gazed at the night sky for a long time, and stars form patterns that have been depicted by characters and folklore from many different cultures, like the Chinese, the Mayans, Incas, the Native Americans. Just about every civilization you could think of had their characters out in the sky. Most of the constellations that we recognize in the Northern Hemisphere have their origins in Greek and Roman mythology. However, many of the major stars have Arabic names. So this is kind of an interesting mixture in the sky. I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. And to really answer that question, I have to go back to the birthplace of modern astronomy, which most scientists believe is in the area we call Mesopotamia. It's between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And it became Persia. Okay, and it was part of the Persian Empire. Today, it's modern-day Iraq for the most part, although there are some other countries in that area as well. It begins with the Sumerians from around 3400 BC, and the Babylonians created a functional theory of the planets. And then the Chaldeans migrated from the Arabian Peninsula into this area as well. And the Chaldeans were very observant of the sky as well, and they discovered the eclipse cycles and with the Saros cycles that we call them, which are the 223 synodic months to predict eclipses. The Chaldean astronomer Seleucus used trigonometry and geometry to support a heliocentric theory, believe it or not. But of course, it was never really adopted, and we eventually decided that the Earth was the center of the universe. Babylonian star catalogs date back from about 1200 BC and include constellations and star names. So, for instance, we see here where we have star names on the left-hand side that flow from that early time, and we can see where the star kind of describes, the end of the constellation. So we have, Acamar at the end of the river, farther down Deneb, which is the tail of the hen, and we see Deneb or variations of that in a couple of places, like Denebula, for instance, which is the tail of the lion. And Dubi, Thuban. So we see these stars that have names related to constellations from the Arabic. Now, they also were very conscious about the movement of the planets, which were just stars that roamed among the other stars, as well as the sun and the moon, and that they only went through a select group of constellations, which we know as the zodiac. And if we look at the ancient Babylon, we see where they have names for the constellations that are very similar to, or describe at least, the same types of characters, animals, and things, for the most part, that we recognize today as being the constellations of the zodiac. So we could see how, the Greeks and Romans didn't invent this. It kind of, it came from ancient Babylonia and then was adopted by the Greeks. The other thing to notice is that the Persian Empire, this is about 500 BC, and it stretches a long way into Central Asia, but it also includes the area around the Mediterranean Sea. It includes Libya and Egypt, as well as up through Turkey and over into the Greece area. And I want to point this out because it isn't like, things were invented in Persia and then the Greeks reinvented it. It was the same peoples, basically, and it kind of evolved over time. The Greek Empire started around 800 BC, and from 800 BC to 400 BC, there was a lot of conquest going on. And around 400 BC, the Greeks developed their history and philosophy. We see names that we are pretty familiar with: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, to name a few. The area around Babylonian declined as the center of scientific knowledge. And the Greeks went ahead and kind of migrated the knowledge of the Chaldeans and became the center for science, math, and philosophy. And we begin to see names that we recognize as well that are names associated with science and math, like Archimedes, Pythagoras, and Euclid. So we see the Greek Empire here, and as you can see, the Greek Empire was, for the most part, included much of the land that was also part of the Persian Empire. So we're talking about the same people. It's just that the whole politics, if you would, or the group that was running it, shifted from Persia over to Greece. Now, the Greek mythology most likely had its origins in the oral traditions of the Minoan civilization of Crete, and that flourished from 3000 BC to 1100 BC. And the Greek poetic authors Homer and Hesiod developed characters that we recognize in Greek mythology today. However, they didn't write the stories, at least not all the stories. There are over 30 authors that created the stories in Greek and Roman mythology. And so that's why when you see Greek and Roman mythology, the stories, a lot of times, if you get out of one source, it has variation from other sources. And that's because you have different people writing the same stories. And a lot of times they're just a little bit different how they end or all that. So that's one of the reasons why you find different versions of the same story. It just depends on the author that created that story. Although historians recognize that much of what was written was fiction, the people of that time accepted stories as factual. They believed that Helios or Sol was the sun god going across the sky, and they believed in Zeus and Hera and all of these gods. Now, Greek mythology developed a whole creation story that that tells about how the gods were created and kind of the genealogy of the gods. Describes the nature of the world and sheds light on their religious and political institutions. Oop, too far. Back up. The Greek astronomy was influenced by Babylonian astronomy, right? We kind of mentioned that kind of migrated up that way. The Greeks developed methods for calculating astronomical positions. The word that we use today, planet, actually comes from the Greek word for wanderers, planetus. And it described these wandering stars among the other stars that are in the celestial sphere. Some of the modern constellations and star names can be found referenced in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And the Greeks created models describing motions of the heavens. So their model of the cosmos is pretty basic, though. You know, they get the flat Earth that's spread out to the oceans, and then the ocean actually came up above the Earth in this sphere, this celestial sphere. So everything was covered by water, so to speak. And the stars, they rose from the ocean and set in the ocean. And and we're going to see where this has an influence in how some of the constellations are depicted in the sky. Then around 285 BC, the Romans began to rise up, and they conquered this land, and they conquered really most of the land that the Greeks had, as well as much of the land around the Mediterranean. So it spread a lot farther west than the Greek Empire. Now, again, it's the same people, right? They just been, it goes from Greek to Roman. So they're heavily influenced by this Greek culture. And the Roman mythology really was basically Greek mythology, but the Romans took the gods and gave them Latin names. The stories themselves were essentially the same. They added a few new ones to explain, like, for instance, the rise of some of the great leaders like Romulus and Remus. That was strictly a Roman mythology story. So we see here's the Roman Empire, and it extends all the way around the Mediterranean, but it includes, again, in the western part of Asia, northern Africa, and southeastern Europe. There, that the same basic area that the Persians had, that the Greeks had, and now it's part of the Roman Empire, which is why these stories flowed so readily from one culture to the next. Now, we talked about how they gave the Greek gods the Roman names, right? So here we have the equivalents, right? So Zeus was the Greek god, the Greek king of the gods. Jupiter is the Roman equivalent of that. Hera and Juno, and so on and so forth. Of course, for us in astronomy, we really recognize the Roman names for astronomical names like Jupiter and Neptune and Venus and Mars, Pluto, and so on and so forth. Now, if we talk about this whole creation of the universe according to the Greco-Roman mythology, I'm going to run through this very quickly, but you get a feel for how the gods came to be. Okay, so we start with the primeval gods, and in the beginning there was chaos. And I'm going to be depicting a lot of things in the Greek mythology and in the stories that I use here in this presentation by taking artwork that was created to show this, because I think the artwork is really, really interesting to look at. So here we see a depiction of the beginning. And in the beginning, there was chaos and a great dark abyss, a black void that stretched to infinity. And from this nothingness came black-winged night and Erebus, where death dwells. And then from death and darkness, the gold-winged love is born. With love came light and its companion day. And again, seemingly from nothingness, Gaia, who's the earth, appears, and she creates for herself Uranus, which is the heavens to surround her, along with the mountains and the seas. And the children of Gaia and Uranus were the race of divinities that were known as the Titans. The Titans were huge monsters. The male Titans were like Oceanus, Hyperion, Coelus, Saturn, Creus, and Iaptus. And then the female Titans were Moneta, Tethys, Thea, Phoebe, Ops, and Themis. And Uranus attempted to hide the Titans, but a Titan named Saturn cut Uranus, and the drops of blood sprang up to become another race of monsters, the Giants, as well as the Furies and the Nymphs. And the Titans, led by Saturn, escape from the place where they were kept, and they yield their power on the world. Now, the gods of Olympus were actually the children of the Titans. And eventually, they came to overthrow the Titans and to rule the world. Now, we talk about the 12 major Olympian gods, and this sculpture kind of shows them. It starts over here on the left-hand side. The first god is partially hidden in this one, but they were called the Olympians because it was believed that they lived on Mount Olympus. Okay, and so this picture here depicts those 12 Olympians along with their attributes that they're associated with. So starting from the left and partially, well, actually mostly hidden there, is Vesta with the scepter, and then Mercury with his winged cap and staff, and Venus, who's veiled, Mars with his helmet and spear, Ceres with the scepter and the wheat sheaf, Vulcan with his staff, Juno with her scepter, Juno with his trident, Minerva, the owl and the helmet, Jupiter with his thunderbolt and staff, Diana, the bow and quiver, and Apollo with his lyre, which is a stringed instrument.
Hey, Dave, is this a good time for ask questions?
Yes.
Jocko Hansen asked early on, what is the ISBN number of your book?
Oh, good question. Hang on a second.
Anybody else have questions while we get this little break?
The ISBN number is 978-3030-47693-9.
Okay.
Did you get that? If not, I can type it in the.
Yeah, it's probably easier if you don't mind just
Let's see if I've got it in the chat. Do I have the chat here?
On the bottom, it's in the ribbon.
Not for me because I think I'm up here.
And Dave, while you're looking for that, wasn't Saturn the child of Uranus? Wasn't Uranus the grandfather of Zeus?
Saturn was the child of Uranus, and Jupiter was the child of Saturn.
Yeah.
Right.
So
correct.
Zeus, yeah.
Yeah, Zeus. Yeah, Zeus. Well, yeah.
Same thing.
Yeah, same thing, only different, right?
Right.
Okay. Let me make a note. I'll put that ISBN number in the chat at the end there to make sure we have it.
And we have another question: is where is that stone you're showing located?
I do not know. It's located on the internet, but I don't know where the stone itself is. That's the honest answer. Okay.
Go ahead, Dave.
All right, let's continue then. So I'm not going to go through this, but there's a whole genealogy of the major mythological characters where we see where, Alcima and Jupiter begat Hercules and so on and so forth. These are the Roman names, right? There's obviously a Greek equivalent to this. Along with this is other mythological characters such as centaurs and Pan, the Pleiades and the Hyades, and all those have a genealogy. And then there's kind of went too far here.
I put a link in the chat group for your Amazon book.
I can do that too. Yep.
I already did.
Oh, you did?
Oh.
Yep.
Oh, okay, great. All right. So, one of the things I wanted to point out was that, of course, these characters are all in the sky, but that in the stories that the Roman mythology has, although the names of the gods were changed to Roman names, the mortal characters, the animals, the places all retain the same name that they had in Greek mythology. It was really only the gods' names that were changed. Okay, so let's see about how these characters wound up in the sky a little bit. I want to talk about a couple of constellations. Obviously, we could go through, and there's, like I said, almost all of the constellations that we see in the Northern Hemisphere have their roots in this. There were other constellations that appeared later during the explorations of the Europeans, especially when they went down to the southern hemisphere. Most of the southern constellations have their names from the explorers, but even some of the northern constellations like Monoceros and Camelopardalis, those came more from the time in the 16th and 17th century when there's exploration. But there's only a handful of those in the northern hemisphere. All right. So around the 1st century BC, there's a Greek astronomer by the name of Claudius Ptolemy who recorded the constellations in the night sky. And so he created these 48 constellations. Well, didn't create them. He documented these 48 constellations. These are the 48 constellations that were recognized at the time. And although he was a Greek astronomer, this was during the Roman Empire. He wasn't stupid. He gave them all Roman names, right? And so you'll see the Latin type of names there, like Delphinus and Capricornus, Scorpius, Sagittarius, and then along with that, you'll see where you have names like Hercules, which is of course the Roman equivalent of Heracles. So these are all, so the constellations all stem from the Roman names, the Latin names. And except for Argo Navis, which was eventually broken up into 4 constellations. Argo Navis was the ship. Argo, it was broken up into Carina, Puppis, Pyxis, and one other one. I can't remember off the top of my head. But those there's Puppis, there was Carina, Pyxis, and Vela. Vela the sails, Pyxis is the compass, Puppis is the stern or the poop deck, and Carina is the keel. So those are the 4 constellations that make up the original Argo Navis constellation. These constellations and the ones that were created from the Argo Navis are the ones that are recognized by the International Astronomical Union. Okay, and all these constellations have some story in ancient Greek and Roman mythology that is associated with them. So let's look at a couple of these stories. Let's start with Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, 2 constellations that we are very familiar with, right? So this is the story of Callisto and Arcas. Callisto was the mother of Arcas. And Callisto was a beautiful daughter of King Lycaon of Arcadia. And she loved hunting. And she became an attendant to Diana, who is the goddess of hunting. Now, when a woman becomes an attendant of a goddess, she's a virgin and she's to remain a virgin. Okay, so but her beauty attracted Jupiter, and Jupiter's kind of a cad. He got involved with a lot of women over the course of mythology. So Jupiter disguised himself as Diana and guided Callisto in her hunting. But when they were alone, he would embrace her and eventually had relations with her, and Callisto became pregnant. And then she bore a son, Arcas. Well, Juno, queen of the gods, obviously wasn't real happy about Jupiter's escapades, but there wasn't anything she could do to Jupiter because he was the king of the gods. So she often took her vengeance out on the woman who was involved in these, even though the woman kind of between a rock and a hard spot. But are you going to turn down the king of the gods, right? So Juno was jealous and enraged by this, and so she turned Callisto into a bear and sent her into the forests of Arcadia. Well, meanwhile, her son, Arcas, grew up to be a skillful hunter. And one day while hunting, he came upon his mother transformed into a bear. And so he was going to shoot her with an arrow, but Jupiter became alarmed and stopped him. And realizing that Callisto would never be safe in the forest, Jupiter grabbed her by the tail and flung her into the heavens, where she became Ursa Major. And so she would not be lonely. He transformed Arcas into a bear and flung him into the heavens to become Ursa Minor. And they say to this day that the bears have long tails from being stretched when Jupiter flung them into the heavens. Now, Juno was incensed that Callisto and Arca were displayed in the heavens. So she asked Neptune, god of the sea, to place them such that they would never be able to rest. Because in mythology, they believed that the stars rose from the ocean, they were in the sky, and then when these constellations set, they rested overnight, or overnight. So by putting them in the northern hemisphere and making them circumpolar, these two constellations would never rest. Okay, any questions at this point? Are we good?
I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. Does anybody have any questions? Michael Cowper wrote, Ptolemy was very important to the pseudoscience astrology major book. Were astronomers and astrologers closer in the ancient world? Is astrology a type of sky myth affecting humans?
I don't talk about this a whole lot, but yes, really, up until I'm going to say the 17th century, astronomers were doing a lot of astrology as well. They were considered expert astrologers, and so a lot of them actually. The major astronomers made their money by doing astrology for the kings and the queens, and that's how they were paid, is by making predictions based on astrology. So yes, the astrology and astronomy were very much very closely linked back, in the.
Steve Schmidt's asking, did the Greeks or Romans identify asterisms, and if so, do any survive today?
Not that I'm aware of. They may have, but I don't know of many asterisms specifically that were identified back then. We know the Chinese recognized that the Big Dipper was a wagon for them. Okay, but they probably did have asterisms, but I don't know of any that were specifically pointed out.
Any other questions?
Okay, let's move on to Taurus the Bull. Now, although Ursa Major and Ursa Minor depict a single story, it's really not unusual for a constellation to be associated with more than one story. And Taurus is a good example of this. Taurus the Bull, the constellation, is actually associated with 3 stories. The first story concerns the beautiful virgin by the name of Europa. She and the other virgins would go to a secluded meadow by the sea to gather flowers. Now, mischievous Venus had her son Cupid shoot one of his arrows into Jupiter's heart, and Jupiter immediately had an overwhelming love for Europa and had to have her. So there was a herd of cattle that was grazing near the seaside where a group of virgins used to go and gather flowers, and so he disguised himself as a white bull and became part of that herd. And the virgins were so attracted by this white bull, as this very gentle white beast. They went and they would go over to him and pet him and all that, and he laid down as if inviting the virgins to climb on his back. And Europa eventually climbed on, and when she did, he jumped up and ran into the ocean. Now, because it was actually Jupiter, he didn't run into the ocean. It was more like on top of the ocean. And Europa realized very quickly that this was no ordinary bull. And Jupiter took her to a secret hideaway on Crete where they were lovers and where he could keep her hidden from Juno. And together they bore 3 sons, Rhadamanthus, Minos, and Sarpedon. Now, there's also 2 more stories associated with the Cretan bull. Okay, one of the stories is part of the 7 labors of Hercules, which I'll discuss a little later. The other story has to do with Theseus. Now, Theseus was the rightful king of Athens, but his evil cousin had taken over, and so when he came to claim the throne, the cousin said, well, you really can't claim the throne unless you show your bravery and prowess. And so he was asked to kill the Cretan bull. Now, Hercules, when he finished his 7th labor, had set the bull free. It came from Crete, but he released it around Athens. And so it was roaming the countryside of Marathon near Athens, terrorizing all the inhabitants and destroying crops. Now, the story is rather long, but Theseus did indeed subdue the bull and brought it back to Athens and sacrificed it to Athena, and then assumed his rightful position as the king of Athens. Now, within Taurus, there are two star clusters, one called the Pleiades and another called the Hyades. So these two open clusters also have their stories associated with them, and they're both visible to the naked eye. The Pleiades are the seven sisters of Atlas and Pleione, and it's a neat little, tight little open cluster that you can see with the naked eye. Most people under a dark sky can see at least 6 stars, and some people with really sharp vision can actually see the 7th star as well. As I said, they were the 7 daughters of Atlas and Pleione, and Atlas was a Titan. And when they were defeated by the gods, Atlas was condemned to hold up the heavens for all eternity. Now, his daughters were so distraught over this that Jupiter placed them in the heavens so they would always be close to their father. In another story, again, about the Pleiades, so we have 2 stories about the Pleiades. Orion was so smitten by the beauty of the Pleiades that he pursued them, but he was never able to catch them. And Jupiter grew tired of this pursuit and placed the Pleiades and Orion in the sky such that Orion could pursue them for all eternity, because the Pleiades actually come up, they're to the west of Orion. And so they rise before Orion and always precede Orion across the sky. So Orion is always pursuing the Pleiades. Then the Hyades is another open star cluster that includes the major star in Taurus called Aldebaran. And the Aldebaran is the eye of the bull. The Hyades cluster kind of depicts the head of the bull. And the Hyades were the daughters of Atlas and Ethra, and Jupiter entrusted the Hyades to raise baby Dionysus. Their brother, Hyas, was killed by a wild boar while hunting. And when the sisters learned of this untimely death, they grieved bitterly. And for their undying grief and thanks for raising Dionysus, Jupiter placed them among the other stars. The Hyades are also known as the rainy ones, as it is believed their tears that fall as rain whenever they are near the horizon, the Earth horizon, which usually occurs in May and November, and those are more the rainy seasons in that area of the world. Now, yeah, we can pause here.
Yeah, just sorry. Mark Newpin asked, politically or religiously, what was the purpose of these stories, I guess, in their society?
Well, I think a lot of the stories were to depict natural wonders that they didn't understand. They didn't know what the sun was, and so it was for them to think of the sun as a god that had a chariot rising across the sky, lightning and thunder. They didn't understand what that was. And so for them, they created these gods. And in the mythology and the religion, it was really kind of a religion, right? That kind of grew just from these natural wonders and explaining nature and what happens in nature. And they just created these stories that went along with it because they didn't understand what they truly were.
Okay, and then Michael Cowper asked a question. The characters in Clash of the Titans are all in the sky. The king, the queen, the daughter Andromeda, Thetis, Perseus, all but the Gorgon Medusa. What happened to Medusa? Was she ever in the sky?
Medusa is in the sky. Perseus is carrying Medusa. So the character Perseus is after he kills Medusa, and the head of Medusa is in the sky with the variable star Algol being the winking star, the winking eye of Medusa.
Dave, was there ever a time where, sounds like the Romans got a lot of their mythology from the Greeks.
Absolutely.
Did you, in your research, see any times when the Greeks got some of their hierarchy, I guess, from some of the Eastern traditions?
Well, I think a lot of the Persian culture had mythology that kind of flowed into the Greeks, and now Persia, that Mesopotamia was a real crossroads because you would have some traders who came in from Asia in there as well as from Africa and Europe, and so it was that's why it was such a center of culture and science at the time. And so it's I haven't really researched back that far that much, but I got to believe that there was probably some some Far Eastern culture that kind of got intertwined in there too. But but really, the Greek and Roman flowed from whatever was developed in that Mesopotamia, Babylonia area. Okay, so let's talk about some legends involve numerous constellations. Okay, for instance, legend of Jason and the Argonauts, we see that we have the ship Argo, as well as Ares, Gemini, Hercules, Lyra, Eridanus, and Draco, all involved in the story of Jason and the Argonauts. In the legend of Perseus, as was already brought up, we have Perseus, who's the hero, Pegasus, Andromeda, Cetus is the sea monster, Cassiopeia the queen, and Cephas the king. I'm not going to talk about those stories. What I am going to talk about, though, is a third one that it contains many constellations, and that is the legend of Hercules. And Hercules, the strong man, and involves all of these constellations. And I'm actually going to go through the legend real quick here. And it's a lengthy story, but I'm going to kind of go through it pretty quickly here. But you can see how they were able to tie these constellations into the legend of Hercules. Now, Hercules itself is a constellation in the sky, not too tough to see, especially in the summertime. It's not a particularly bright constellation, but it lies to the west of Lyra. So if you can find Vega and just go to the west of that, you'll be able to find the keystone of Hercules in the center there, where M13 is, and then the rest of the constellation from that. We see where some of the stars that are in there, like Rasalgeti and Carnaphoros. Rasalgeti probably comes from the Arabic, meaning the head of the kneeling one. Carnaphoros sounds more Greek to me, and it's the club bearer. And then M13, of course, is a globular cluster, the great globular cluster. That is a really favorite target for amateur astronomers. It looks beautiful through telescopes. M92 is another globular cluster in that constellation. Now, if we go to the story of Hercules, we find that Hercules was the son of, who knew it? Jupiter, of course, and the mortal Alcmena, who was a princess. And now Jupiter's wife, Juno, was insanely jealous of the union and vowed to kill Hercules. In fact, Juno failed to kill Hercules as a youth by sending 2 poisonous snakes while he slept. He awoke and he actually killed the snakes. And he just continued to grow in strength and prowess, and eventually went on to marry Megara, who is the daughter of Cretan, king of Thebes, and they had 3 sons. But Juno, who was very jealous, caused Hercules to go mad, and he killed his wife and her 3 sons. And afterwards, he was so distraught by this that he went to an oracle to see if there's anything he could do to make up for this horrible deed that he did. And the oracle said that if he performed 10 tasks that were given to him by Eurystheus, his murderous deed would be forgiven. Well, Juno was still jealous that Hercules was the offspring of Jupiter, and so she conspired with Eurystheus to make up these now famous 12 labors of Hercules, and we'll find out why there are 12 labors instead of just 10. So we'll start out with the first labor, and the first task was to slay the Nemian Lion, which is depicted by Leo the Lion. Now, the Nemian Lion was the offspring of Selene, the goddess of the moon, and it roamed the valley of Nemea and was a terrorizing beast, terrorizing the inhabitants. And this monster of a lion had a hide so tough that no arrow could pierce it. And so when Hercules went to fight this lion, he tried his arrows, he tried spears, nothing penetrated the hide. So he took his olive wood club and beat the lion over the head with that, stunning it, and then grabbed it and just strangled the lion. And then afterwards, it said that he actually used the lion's sharp claws to skin the lion, and he was able to use the hide and wore it to defend himself in some of the future battles that he had. And so he went back to Eurystheus with the hide of the lion, and so he completed his first task, his first labor, as they say. Now, the second labor was the slaying of the Lernaean Hydra, which is depicted by Hydra, the water snake. And this evil beast had 9 heads. and if one got hurt, two would grow in its place. But Hercules took along with him his charioteer Iolaus, and Iolaus had a flaming torch, and as Hercules sliced off the heads, Iolaus would cauterize the end to keep the head from growing back. And the final immortal head was chopped off, and Hercules buried it deep in the ground. And before leaving, Hercules dipped his arrows in the blood of the Hydra, which is lethal. Now, Sagitta represents the arrows. Eurystheus, when he got back and was able to demonstrate that he had killed the Hydra, Eurystheus said that the task didn't count, though, because Iolaus helped him with it. So the third labor that he got was capturing the Erymanthean boar. The people of Mount Erymanthus lived in fear of this deadly animal, and he just chased the animal into the mountains, into the deep snow, and just basically wore it down, and then was able to catch it with a net and brought it back to the king Eurystheus, who was so frightened of the beast that he went and hid in his bronze jar, which is depicted here. So he's hiding in his jar with Hercules holding the boar over his head. The fourth labor is capturing the hind of Cernia. And the goddess Diana loved and protected this stubborn little deer, which had gold horns. And Hercules found it a challenge to capture the delicate hind without hurting it and making Diana angry. So after following the hind for an entire year, he safely captured it, carried it away, and showed it to Eurystheus. And then he returned the hind to Diana. For his fifth labor, he was charged with eliminating the Stymphathian birds, which involved Corvus the crow and Sagitta the arrow. Now, these murderous birds lived around Lake Stymphalus. Their claws and beaks were sharp as metal, and their feathers flew like darts. So Hercules scared them out of their nests with bronze castanets that were fashioned by Vulcan, and then he killed them with the poison arrows that he made from the Hydra's blood. The sixth labor was the killing of the Aegean stables, Aquilius the Fool, but also Taurus the Bull could also be represented in this one too. King Aegeus, as a result of divine involvement, his livestock were granted immunity from disease, so he never cleaned his stables. For over 30 years, he never cleaned the stables. So Hercules was told to clean them completely in a single day. So Hercules offered to clean King Aegeus' stables in return for 1/10 of the king's herd, and the king agreed to that. So to do so, Hercules made two rivers bend so that they flowed into the stables and basically flushed out all the filth. When he reported his deed to Eurystheus, Eurystheus didn't count it because he was actually hired by the king and didn't just do the deed. The seventh labor was the capturing of the Cretan bull, which we already mentioned a little bit. This savage bull was kept by King Minos of Crete and was said to be insane and breathe fire. Well, Hercules wrestled the mad beast to the ground and subdued it, and then brought it back to Eurystheus, who again saw this manic bull and just hid in his bronze jar again. Unfortunately, the king ordered the beast be set free. So it was set free in Rome Marathon, the region of Greece, causing terror wherever it was until Theseus eventually captured and killed it. The eighth labor was capturing the horses of Diomedes, and Aquilius the Fool represents this horse. And King Diomedes was the leader of the Pistones. He fed his bloodthirsty horses on the human flesh of unsuspecting visitors. When Hercules was alone, he harnessed the horses and attempted to leave. The horses made a racket, and Diomedes came out with his guards. Diomedes led the attack, but Hercules dealt him a tremendous blow. While Hercules fought the guards, the horses ate Diomedes and immediately became tame. So after defeating the guards, Hercules harnessed the horses to a chariot and rode it back to Eurystheus, who dedicated the horses to Juno. The ninth labor was retrieving the girdle of the Amazon. Again, Sagitta the arrow is involved in this. Hercules went to the land of the Amazons, where the queen welcomed him and agreed to give him her girdle for Eurystheus' daughter. Well, Juno became angry that the Amazons welcomed Hercules and spread the rumor that Hercules actually came as an enemy. So at this, the Amazons attacked Hercules, and he used his poison arrows to defeat them and capture the queen's sister, Melanope. The ransom was the girdle, which he received, and he delivered the girdle to Eurystheus, who in turn gave it to his daughter. The 10th labor was the capturing of the cattle Geron. So Geron was a winged monster with 3 human heads and had a herd of beautiful red cattle. He guarded his prized herd with the help of a giant and a vicious 2-headed dog. While on his way, Hercules became crazed with the heat of the sun, and in a blind rage shot a poison arrow at the chariot of Sol, the sun god. Sol was so amused by the audacity of this mortal that he not only shielded him from the rays of the sun, but he allowed Hercules to use his great golden goblet or cup, represented by Crater, to use as a boat to sail to Eurythia, where Geron and his herd were located. In a huge battle, and I won't go into details here, but Hercules killed Geron, the giant, and the dog, and loaded the cattle in the boat and sailed back to Spain. And he actually crossed around Gibraltar. And after returning the cup to Sol, Hercules had to defeat Cacus, who attempted to steal the cattle. In honor of his victory, Hercules erected an altar, represented by Ara, over the spot where he killed Cacus, and then he brought the cattle to King Eurystheus. Now, Eurystheus reminded Hercules that he had help on 2 labors, so he had to complete 2 more. So the first, the 11th labor, was to retrieve 3 golden apples Juno gave Jupiter. Now, these apples were in the garden of Hesperides, guarded by a dragon, represented by Draco. Atlas, who held the heavens on his shoulders, was the only one the dragon would allow to pass unharmed. Hercules struck a bargain with Atlas and held up the heavens while Atlas retrieved the apples. Atlas intended to leave with the apples, but Hercules tricked him, and Atlas was left holding up the heavens while Hercules returned to Eurystheus with the apples. Eurystheus knew better than to keep them. He gave them back to Hercules, who gave them to Minerva, who returned them to the garden. Eurystheus knew that he only had one more chance to dispose of Hercules, as Juno wanted, so he ordered the capture of Cerberus, the 3-headed guard dog of the underworld, without using any weapons. Hercules entered the netherworld, found Pluto and Persephone, and got their permission to borrow the dog. Using his lion mane for protection, Hercules wrestled the dog's wild heads to the ground and held it until it lost consciousness. Then he carried the dog to Eurystheus, who screamed at seeing the horrifying beast and immediately hid in his bronze jar again. Hercules proclaimed that he had completed all his tasks. Cerberus was returned unharmed to the underworld, and Hercules had completed all his penance, and he felt like a new man. But Jupiter knew that Juno would never relent from trying to kill Hercules. So, for his bravery in the face of danger and his completion of 12 very difficult tasks, Jupiter granted Hercules immortality and placed him among the stars. I guess a good spot to stop.
Yeah, Dave,
Yeah.
Several slides ago, when you had the listing of all those constellations,
Yes.
the Greek constellations and the Roman ones, almost all those constellations were far northern constellations. It was interesting that Arrow was on that list because I think the declination is around -55 for Era. So there's no way that they could have seen that from Greece or Rome.
Right. So Ptolemy is actually did his work in Egypt, a little bit farther south. And so I think he may have been able to see that from the far southern part of where he was.
Great, thanks. Does anybody else have any questions?
Okay, let's move on then.
There's one, Michael Cowper.
Oh.
One theory of ancient myths suggests that when one culture subdues another, the chief male god of the winners, the Greeks or the Romans, such as Zeus, takes a major female goddess of the losers. This supposedly eases the joining of the two cultures. Are there any comments or any examples?
I can't comment on that. I hadn't heard that. It may be. I mean, throughout history, we've seen where two warring factions have gotten peace by having the marriage of the sons and daughters of the two factions. But I hadn't heard that for the Greeks and Romans. No.
Okay, that's it.
Okay, let's turn to the planets now. So the planets were named after the Roman gods, right? And again, these are the wanderers. So they had a special place. Now the of course, back then there were only 5 planets that were visible, right? Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Okay, but as time went on and other planets were discovered, they kept the naming of the planets what's the word I want? The naming of them consistent. So, and so we have Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. The other interesting thing, well, so we find that they were named after the Roman gods. Saturn was actually a Titan, of course. He was the father of the gods, including Jupiter, and Uranus was actually a primeval god, but it was part of the Roman mythology as well. Okay, and so the tradition of naming these after Greco-Roman, actually the Roman gods, was maintained. Now, in addition to this, when we get to the moons of the planets, for the most part, the moons were named after characters associated with that planet. So, for instance, with Mars, Deimos and Phobos were the sons of Mars. For Jupiter, as we mentioned, he was a cad. There's a number of mortals and the like that were associated with Jupiter, either as women that he had relations with, or their offspring, or even his grandchildren. Okay, so Saturn, being the father of Jupiter, we'll find that there are a number of moons associated with Saturn, though not all, and I'll get to that in a minute. Uranus is a notable exception to this. Uranus was discovered by Sir William Herschel, and he was, of course, an astronomer at the favor of the king, and so he felt it would be more appropriate to have any moons found around Uranus be associated with characters from the works of William Shakespeare and Alexander Pope. And so we find that the moons of Uranus follow that pattern of being named after Shakespearean characters and characters from Alexander Pope. Neptune and Pluto, again, we have those moons associated with their planets names. Okay. Asteroids were also named and have been able to follow the pattern of being named after Greco-Roman. In some cases, they do have Greek names because there's a lot of moons and a lot of asteroids, but they all come from Greco-Roman mythology. Now, there's a break from tradition. Okay, so around the beginning of the 21st century, around 2000, they meaning astronomers and eventually the International Astronomical Union, decided that it was appropriate to start deviating from the naming conventions of solar system objects to strictly Greco-Roman mythology. And so what we find is that some of the moons that were discovered by Cassini, as well as the dwarf planets and their moons, are named after characters from other mythologies. Okay, so for example, if we talk about those mythologies, the Saturnian moons, satellites, come from there's 3 groups of those satellites that are actually named from Western European mythologies. We have actually that's not true. So one of them is named after the Inuit, which is what we sometimes refer to as the Native Americans up in Alaska. Some people call them Eskimos. That's not a proper term for them. It's Inuit. And the Inuit group includes 7 prograde outer moons that orbit about 186 to 297 radii from Saturn. Then there's the Gaelic group, which are 4 prograde outer moons that are of similar color and orbit in approximately the same distance from Saturn, from about 207 to 302 radii. And then there's the Norse group, which consists of 46 retrograde outer moons from 150 to 310 radii from Saturn. And also Phoebe is part of that group as well. And so we find that names from those mythologies. And in the book, hang on a second. Yeah. Before I get to your question, in the book, I actually give kind of a brief account of what these mythologies are. Okay, Norse mythology, Celtic, Gaelic mythology, Inuit mythology, and we'll get to Hawaiian, Rapa Nui, and Tongva in a minute. Go ahead.
It's probably a good time to ask Mark Nupin's question. Do Chinese or Asian historical cultures have astronomical stories?
They did. They haven't been depicted yet in the naming of solar system objects. I fully expect, though, since they've already deviated at this point to other mythologies, that as dwarf planets and the like are continuing to be discovered, that they may very well choose names from those mythologies as well. As of right now, solar system objects haven't been named from Chinese. We know that the Chinese do have mythological stories, though, and constellations of their own. Okay, so the newly found dwarf planets have names reflecting other mythologies as well. And the tradition of naming the natural satellites with names related to the parent object, that remains. So for instance, Haumea is the Hawaiian goddess of childbirth, and it's a dwarf planet. It has 2 satellites, and they're named Hayaka and Namaka, who are the daughters of Haumea. Okay, so in summary, we got the Roman stories that are based on the stories from ancient Greece. Romans changed the names of the gods to Latin names, and the constellations of major planets received their names during the time of the Roman Empire, and they stuck. Today, they are recognized by the International Astronomical Union and represent 48 of the 88 total constellations in the night sky. And apart from Uranus, planets, asteroids, and moons, including Pluto and Ceres, have followed this tradition. And then beginning with the 21st century, solar system objects are being named after characters from other mythologies. That's basically it. So any other questions?
That's great. Brandon had a question about your book.
Yeah.
There's 2 editions of that, right?
Right.
So what is in the second edition that's not in the first edition?
So the second edition is where I expanded to the other mythologies. So although I mentioned those mythologies in the first book, I didn't elaborate on them at all, and I didn't elaborate on the names of that were associated with those mythologies. So in the new book, the satellites of Saturn that are named after Gaelic, Norse, and Inuit mythology, as well as the dwarf planets, I first of all go and give kind of a brief synopsis of what that mythology is and some of the major characters of that mythology. Okay, I've got a whole chapter devoted to all those different mythologies. And then I talk about the characters and how they and give a story about the characters that are named that have names in the solar system. Okay, so that's probably the biggest difference. The other thing I did was that I didn't have in the first book were those 10 brightest asteroids that I mentioned here. Let me go back. Sorry. So these 10 asteroids I talk about in the book, talk about how bright they are, because almost all of these you can see through a modest telescope when they're at opposition. And then I give the stories that are associated with these 10 asteroid names as well.
Great. And Brandon followed up. Are there any other books that you've got planned?
As a matter of fact, there is. I've just completed a book that is currently with my editor, and I'll probably have to do a little bit of editing on it. But I've done a book about some of the more interesting stars in the sky and the astronomers that discovered them. And I tell a little biographical story about the astronomers and how they became interested in astronomy and how they came to discover the star and the characteristics of that star. That is currently, I've completed writing it. Like I said, the editor will probably have some things for me to do, but I expect that to be published probably September, October timeframe.
Great. And then Trina asks, how long did it take for you to research and write the second book?
So the second book was just, adding on to the first book. The first book took me about a year to write. Okay. And then the second edition took me close to a year to write, only because I had to research all of these mythologies that I wasn't terribly familiar with, like Norse mythology, Inuit mythology, Rapa Nui mythology, and the like. So, I wasn't familiar with those mythologies, so I had to research those and write about those. So, yeah, it takes a while.
A few more questions here. Michael Cowper asks, how about one or two Milky Way myths, the Greek, the Nordic?
The only one that I can think of is, I think it's
I don't remember.
Is it Theseus? Anyway, he stole the chariot of Saul, and he dipped down and got close to the earth and scorched the earth and all that. And Jupiter, with his thunderbolt, knocked him out of the sky. And it said that when he was knocked out of the sky, he flew across the sky, landed in the river Eridanus. His path across the sky was the Milky Way.
Oh, interesting. Dave, isn't there a story about Orion and Scorpio and Scorpius?
Well, yeah. So, and that's one of those things where the story can end in a couple of different ways. So, Orion's story is kind of lengthy, but he eventually winds up with Diana, the goddess of hunting, and he used to hunt with her, and would distract her, and she had something to do with making sure that the moon and the cycles of the moon were right, and they were kind of being disrupted because she was distracted by Orion, and Apollo was her brother, and he didn't like this, so he conspired with Juno to see if we could do away with Orion, and Juno sent a giant scorpion down to battle with Orion, and so Scorpius and so the scorpion and Orion battled. In one account, Orion was killed by the scorpion. In another account, Orion was the son of Neptune, and so he was able to go out into the ocean and survive well on, swimming in the ocean. And he went out way far away from the shore, and the scorpion couldn't follow him. But when Diana came back from a hunting trip, he was out there, and Apollos, knowing the competitiveness of Diana, told her, "Hey, I bet you can't hit that object out in the ocean there." And she didn't know what it was, and so she fired her arrow, and it struck Orion and killed him. So Orion was killed, and so Jupiter, because Orion was a great hunter, placed him up in the heavens. But he also recognized the fact that he was defeated in some sort of fashion by the scorpion, and so he put the scorpion up in the heavens as well. However, just to make sure there is no conflict between the two, he put them in opposite parts of the heaven, so that when Orion's up, the scorpion is not, and vice versa.
Great. Tim asks, did Newton, Galileo, and others in their writings discuss any of what you are discussing, or do they just focus on just looking and identifying what they saw?
I don't know of them mentioning anything about what I'm talking about in their writings.
Yeah, I don't remember anything either. And then J.H. Fox wrote, great job, Dave. I often refer to the constellations as the original graphic novels since they illustrate the stories.
Right.
As you just basically have just laid out for us.
Yeah. So it's kind of fun to go out in the night sky and see these constellations and know some of the stories behind them and just look at them. And of course, there you can find books about the stories in the stars, and there are writers who have wrote about other cultures as well, like the Chinese and the like. So, it's every culture had their way of grouping the stars into characters and like. Although it's interesting because Orion, for instance, almost every culture has that star grouping as a hunter in the sky because it's just so unique.
Mm-hmm. As an aside to that, aside from just researching books on these subjects, you can actually also get apps. I have an app on my phone about Indian constellations, for example.
Oh, there you go.
Explains them all.
Sure.
Matt says Subaru is a Japanese name for the Pleiades, hence the logo.
Yes. Correct. Yep.
That's all the questions that are listed. Does anybody else have any questions for Dave? Well, Dave, as usual, you did a fantastic job.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I really learned a lot, actually. And I saw we had up to 82 people on the call, which is amazing.
That's cool.
Does anybody else have any comments or any other add-ins? I guess that's it. Thanks, Dave.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, guys, just to let you know, the next BSIG presentation will be on Saturday, March 27th at 1 o'clock. I will be presenting all about deep sky objects. So we'll talk about the different kinds of objects, nebulae, galaxies, etc. And also in the context of the the life cycle from birth to death of the universe and how these objects play into that. So again, that's at 1 o'clock on Saturday, March 27th. And I hope to see you guys there. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.